Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is Freedom Project Media. I am really thrilled today to have as my guest in studio here, Dr. Sandra Stotsky. Dr. Stotsky is an amazing warrior. She is an education reformer, longtime university professor, one of the world's foremost specialists in English language arts developmental learning. Dr. Stotsky, I want to thank you for being here, and thank you for all your work over the years.
Thank you for inviting me for your program.
Well, Common Core remains in the news, even though pretty much every state in the union has now rebranded it. You walk into a public school today, almost anywhere in the nation, and you sit down with a principal to talk about Common Core. The first thing the principal's going to do, or a superintendent, is look you in the eyes and say, we don't have Common Core here anymore. We have the Indiana state standards. We have the Sunshine Standards down in Florida. We don't have Common Core. This is not an issue. First thing I'd like to ask you about is the rebrand. Common Core is not only everywhere in our schools, but it's evolved beyond English and math, hasn't it, to become kind of a national way of looking at almost every single subject.
It has metastasized, as I would say, and so now it's in the textbooks and other materials, including our college readiness tests, which indicate that they are aligned to Common Core. Anything that's aligned to Common Core is basically Common Core.
And after all these years, you and I have been, and that hundreds of activists across the country, I've been privileged to stand by you on a stage and talk about this, and our paths have crossed many times. And I know you've been all over testifying before state legislatures. Let's start with this question. Is there any aspect of Common Core now, in retrospect, that's not as bad as you thought it was going to be? Is there any aspect of it that you think has actually exceeded your expectations?
It's hard for me to think of anything that has improved education from the Common Core project, because all the indicators that we have seem to suggest that almost everything is going downhill. Gap is widening. General scores are either plateauing or going down. I'll stop there.
And while we're here, so we've gotten here, right? The worst aspects of I love the word you use, metastasize, because as we know, it's cancer that metastasizes. And certainly what's been going on with education at the federal level and the transfer of so much control over education away from local communities, away from the classroom teachers, away from the states now and up to the federal level. That's the big cancer. And you identified that early on. We spent 6 years talking about it ourselves across the country, that there was a very limited window that we had maybe back in 2011, 2012, 2013, the very, very narrow window that the country had to fight this back. That window has long since slammed shut. Now, if you want to reform education, you really have to go through Washington, D.C., even at the state level. Do you see any hope in the future, thanks to pieces of legislation like the ESSA Act, right? The Every Student Succeed Act? It now becomes much more difficult at the state level to do any kind of meaningful change in our classroom.
It certainly is more difficult now than it was, but I still continue to think that state legislatures can do more than they actually have done. Some have tried to pass legislation in some way affecting Common Core and have not been able to pass because of a governor's veto, or even within the legislature not getting approval from the committee that the bill was going through. But there are things that state legislators can do.
And as this continues to metastasize, I'm hearing from more and more teachers, even teachers who thought they liked Common Core 5 and 6 years ago, who are utterly frustrated about their inability to be creative in the classroom, to deviate, or to even create their own lesson plans in many instances. We knew this was coming, but talk a little bit, if you can, about what this means for teachers moving forward, too.
The teachers are to be aligned to Common Core as much as possible, because the attempt was really being made from a centralized source of policy making, USED, if not by the people supporting the USED, in that teachers were to follow directives to make sure that all conditions across classrooms in this country were as equalized as possible. Think about what that means for creativity, variation, or even diversity. It can't occur at the classroom pedagogical level.
That is a remarkable observation. I think it's an important one that has been made many times. I've made it myself, that the progressive educrats who are behind so much of this, they're destroying diversity. They are not treating kids like individuals. They are not treating individual students with individual gifts and talents and abilities. This is a one-size-fits-all way of regulating education. And for the first time in American history, it's really controlled centralized at the federal government. While we're talking about that, are you surprised? I'm really not. Donald Trump paid a lot of lip service to getting rid of Common Core. Betsy DeVos, the new Secretary of Education, has actually came out about 6 months ago and said there is no Common Core in the schools anymore. So I don't know if that's just disingenuous or if she's lying about that or if she's ignorant. But your thoughts on the Trump education paradigm and why haven't things changed?
I have several thoughts about that, and I cannot say I have interior or internal evidence for it. I don't think President Trump understands educational policy in detail. I'm not even sure that Betsy DeVos understands the details of policy making, but many of the people, the personnel at the USED, were either hired and recommended for hiring because they would continue to promote the Common Core agenda, or they were replaced by people who had already served to promote the Common Core agenda. We haven't had anybody come into the USED that I am aware of that has alternative views on how to strengthen public education. It's been how to implement Common Core, which is not to strengthen public education.
That is a remarkable observation, too. You know, this is true in so many forms of government, but politicians come and go, presidents come and go, congressmen and senators come and go, but the bureaucracy that runs this country on every aspect, it stays. You have 30, at the Department of Education, you've got 20, 30-year professionals who have never left. They're progressive in their worldview. They believe profoundly in the centralization of education, more control for Washington. And so Betsy DeVos, it could have been anybody, but Betsy DeVos steps in, and whatever her view of education is, the infrastructure is already skewed dramatically toward the status quo. And so this is a part of one of the things I've been harping about a lot, and I don't know how to fix it. Unless you actually purge the Department of Education and bring in people who are fair-minded, if not opposed to Common Core. How do you change this? I mean, you said that you're optimistic that at the state legislatures, more can be done. But how can enough be done at the state legislatures to really turn back what's happening now at the federal level, which seems to have so much disproportionate control now?
There are probably two prongs to pursue. One is just simply getting rid of the USED. It was created several decades ago. It can be disestablished, eliminated. There isn't anything that says we must have a USED at the federal level. The Constitution doesn't require it, and we know that the Constitution does require that education policy be linked to the state level, which includes local level as well. The second prong is making state legislators realize that that is where, under state constitutions, the power for policy making on a state level does reside. And local boards simply have been told that they have no power when they still do, as far as we know from some legal analysis here in Massachusetts, of 400 years going back to the time when we were a colony, that there are policy-making powers that adhere at the local level only, because that's where your locally elected people are. They're either at the state or local level for education policy making. No one at the national level has been elected to be an education leader.
And as you and I know, we've been lobbying legislatures for 7 years about their power. and very often in red states where you have so-called Republicans in charge of everything from the governor's house all the way down to the assembly. And none of them have moved on this. Partially, I think, because of the huge federal dollars, the bribe that went along with Common Core. How much of this, how much of the states...
I think that the bribe is only part of the problem. Okay. I think we need to understand that even Betsy DeVos had been actively working for Jeb Bush's foundation. And we do need to name names. He had a particular goal to be considered the education president when he had been in Florida. It didn't work out, but there is, through his foundation, which has received support from the Gates Foundation, there are many links to Betsy DeVos and others at the USED, and they are all pro-Common Core because they seem to think it's the only silver bullet that would actually close what they call achievement gaps. It's widened them, but a little bit of reality doesn't seem to matter.
That's well said. I believe the exact same thing, that this crosses political party lines. I mean, there are as many Republican fingerprints over this as there are Democrat. And despite the fact that education is backstepping, we're falling further behind, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We're falling further behind in almost every measurable category. The federal government, the people at the Federal Department of Education, the centralized players in all of this, they seem to be okay with a greatly diminished educational future for America, if indeed all kids get the same bad education. Is that fair to say?
That's the key. There's an egalitarian thrust to their educational philosophy. All kids are to perform at the same level. It doesn't mean that they will perform at a high level. They can all perform the same at a very low level, which is where we're heading, but nevertheless, they will be equal. That is someone's perverse version of equity.
Right, and we've seen this across...
Dumb.
Well, that's right, because it's really easy. Every time you lower standards or don't enforce standards, the more kids can meet them, right? The less pressure there is to have high achievement, the easier it is for everybody to be at the same place. In other words, it's really easy to get all kids to a lower and lower and lower level. The minute you start raising educational expectations.
It certainly is, because math has to be taught. So it's very easy to withhold the teaching of certain things by higher levels to get everybody together to get these so-called gaps closed at a lower level. And especially easy if you have a large propaganda machine that's telling everybody that you've raised standards.
Exactly. And is this, I think this is an example of fake news, isn't it, Sandy? This argument that the standards are higher.
They've never successful campaign, right?
They've never been higher.
Everybody and convinced everybody that by changing from content standards to skills-based standards, you've increased academic demands. Who is going to argue against someone who has an EDD or a PhD at the end of their name in curriculum and instruction and claim to have come from, quotes, the best education schools in the country or the best universities? We have a serious problem of people who are willing to believe almost anything in education so long as they can keep their jobs.
I call it social justice education, Sandy. That's the word I coined for it. It is the argument that we're going to put egalitarianism, equality, we're going to put the leveling of distinction ahead of actual academic achievement, and we're going to call that success. And while we're on that topic, this sort of closes the circle about where we started. If what we just said is true, we now know why teachers are so frustrated, because it is no longer the primary job of a teacher to teach, to allow kids to get as far ahead as they can. It is now the purpose of teachers, and I think this is fair to say, to be basically diversity babysitters, to make sure that low-performing kids aren't marginalized and that high-performing kids, wherever necessary, are held back in the name of equity.
That's right. And you can see that the entire thrust of everything we do in education is the low achiever or the low income student. If it doesn't improve according to their view of whatever you're doing. If it doesn't improve their lot, then you're doing something wrong. And who is the hapless superintendent or teacher to disagree with what these so-called self-appointed experts tell them, especially if they have money that they are controlling?
But here's the rub, Sandy. We have a spate of new tests and statistics that show that the gap between the middle-income kids and the low-income kids is actually widening. So the social justice mentality towards education is actually hurting lower-income kids more. Why is that?
It's going to hurt them more because they were indeed more vulnerable. But it doesn't matter to the policymakers because it's dragging all the others down, the 75% of the student body that was doing average or above average, that is the real target of the Common Core project. How do you bring them down to the level of the bottom 25% who are going to do worse? Because I can speak from my experience in Massachusetts, they will always do worse if educators aren't aiming for the top. You know that as an educator. A good teacher always taught to the top, and that was what brought the bottom up. Now, is the goal is to bring the top down to the bottom is going to suffer even more, but no one cares.
No one cares indeed. And this, I think we have to say it, this isn't education. This is anti-education. This is not just alternative education. This is not experimental education. This is de-education. This is the willful undereducating of our kids in the weird notion that it's going to promote some kind of strained version of social justice. And Sandy, while we're on this, let's transition to Massachusetts. One of the great heartbreaking tragedies is you had a state like Massachusetts, your state, a state that you helped get to the level of success that they formerly had. One of the great success stories of American education was the state of Massachusetts prior to 2010. This was one of the few states in the Union where if you pulled it out of the United States, actually did really well vis-a-vis the other industrialized nations of the world. And now since 2010, with the adoption of Common Core, Massachusetts falls farther and farther and farther back to the mediocre pack that is American education. And we have a new article out, Pioneer, right there located by you in Boston. Talk about what the Pioneer Institute has just found in their recent study of Common Core.
Pioneer very wisely asked an English professor, Mark Bauerlein, and James Milgram, the mathematician from Stanford, whom I testified with for many years over the course of the country before state legislatures, who was on the Common Core Validation Committee with me. But they asked the right people who were experts in English and in math to look at the so-called revised standards that the state prepared as part of its 4-year education plan for ESSA, E-S-S-A. And they came out with a devastating report showing in detail how these revised standards were simply a slight revision, if at all, of Common Core, and how Common Core was far lower in academic demand than whatever we had before, which were among the best in the country. These were people who know standards, English language arts, as well as math. And so here is the Pioneer Institute's own report by its own independent experts, because they're not being paid by the Gates Foundation to show that whatever a state has come up with meets Common Core's vision or version of academic demand. They are unlike all of the other foundations, including the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation, or even others, individuals as well as institutes or foundations that have been subsidized to promote Common Core and any of its links to testing, curriculum materials, or related aspects of the Common Core project. And the Pioneer Institute has done something that we should applaud, because it hired experts to actually look at what the state has proposed as revised standards and compared them to whatever was there before.
This is confirmation that they were not looking for the highest, best, most successful educational paradigm. What they were looking for, because they would have consulted you if they did. What they were looking for was how to pull apart what people like you had created. That you were the problem, Sandy, because you created a circumstance that allowed all kids to get better, but allowed the best kids to really excel. And that was the big crime. We wanted to pull that to pieces. This is what they did.
They were not happy, and by they, I mean the forces behind Common Core. They were not happy with a state that not only improved the top, but actually improved the bottom too. Right. Because it was one of our great achievements that all students improved, because we had a philosophy of improving all students' academic achievement. We weren't trying to improve just the bottom, or just the middle, or just the top. We were trying to improve as the state legislature wanted in the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act of 1993. It wanted all kids to do better because they all needed to do better. And that was the charge that I implemented. Nobody was interested in finding out what you actually do, not only with standards, but with teacher education, which we're now facing a huge problem with in K-12, because there is an attempt to turn that into a tool for promoting Common Core. In other words, to promote the egalitarian downward spiral that Common Core has turned out to be.
Well, I see that all the time. You're a professor of English language arts. I'm an English professor at a university. I've taught at 7 of them. And I see it. What's happening in the education departments on college campuses, because these are kids that get sent to me. My state of Wisconsin requires kids teach Shakespeare. High schools teach Shakespeare. I'm a Shakespeare professor. So the education department sends me their education English majors so that I can teach them how to teach Shakespeare. And I see it. What's happening in the ed departments is they're throwing out competencies, they're throwing out standards, they're throwing out achievement, and they're teaching kids, they're teaching young teachers nothing more than social justice imperatives. Like you said, they're teaching them how to become good little Common Core mentors, babysitters who don't really teach or lead classes, who aren't responsible for excellence in the classroom, whose only real purpose is to implement, oversee, and approve the centralized curriculum, which we now know has failed. And let's talk, Sandy. Let's talk about English. The Pioneer Institute, Mark Bauerlein is also an English professor down at Emory University in Georgia, wonderful fella. And he absolutely devastating what the Pioneer Institute has seen with regards to the English standards. Let me just read you this. According to a new study released by the Boston-based Pioneer Institute, while Common Core led to tumbling scores on the NAEP in both English and math for Massachusetts students, the 2017 standards update shows that students' performance in English is deteriorating further as math scores level off, plateau, as they did. Quote from Mark Bauerlein, "These standards, the English standards, rely on process and skills-based ideas which brush aside knowledge of Western and English literary traditions, and they promote mediocrity." This is right. My kids come to college now after 7 years of Common Core. They don't know a single thing about our literary heritage. They can't read a poetic text from 100 years ago. They have no historical sense of the evolution of Western literature. All that these teachers are doing are putting squishy multicultural readings together for their high school kids that have no connectivity, that aren't aimed at improving kids' vocabulary or comprehension skills. The only purpose of all the great Western classics have been removed to be replaced with, again, squishy, feel-good, multicultural pieces that promote a worldview but don't enhance the kids' skills.
And I've been able to identify the problem, I hope, in a way that would suggest some objectivity on my part, because I've been looking at reading levels. And there is a company in Wisconsin, Renaissance Learning, that has been publishing on a yearly basis a report on what American kids read by grade level, hundreds of thousands of children from K to 12. And when you look at the reading level of what students read in the high school level years, you find that it's been going down steadily since the beginning of the century, as a matter of fact. So the problem isn't all Common Core. Common Core is simply feeding in to a long-term trend and accelerating that trend downward. But there you can see the fact that kids can't read more. The average high school graduate reads at a 7th grade level approximately. And if they're going to be deemed college ready, that explains the problem you have at the university level. And do we hear other professors in math and English speaking up and raising ruckus with their own president or their own boards of trustees or regions? We don't hear about that. Why aren't they saying something about these students who have been determined to be college and career ready, reading at the same, if not lower level than the students they were getting before? They're not reading at a college readiness level. They're not being asked to read anything more difficult than they had been.
You're exactly right. My freshmen at the university read at about a 7th grade level. I have to literally take my freshmen and reteach them how to read. I have to expose them to compound sentences. I have to expose them to how to read not a paper, Sandy. I have to teach them how to read a paragraph and be able to make consistent sense out of it, let alone stringing paragraphs together. It's absolutely shocking. And the one thing you didn't mention is there are a lot of professors complaining at the universities. However, the position of the universities has become, let's dumb down our entrance requirements. Let's lower our overall expectations, because thanks to Common Core, we're getting all sorts of kids applying to college who in the past never got to go because, they weren't qualified. But we're bringing all these kids to campus now. We're bringing these kids to campus without the skills to succeed. And the social justice warriors at the university say, we've brought them to campus, we can't fail them. So if they can't read, they can't read. We've got to give them diplomas. And so the whole system, it absolutely precedes Common Core.
All gone down.
It's exactly right. Let me leave you, but before we move off of English, Sandy, I'll give you the last word on English, but let me leave you with this last quote from Mark Bauerlein about what these standards were doing. Quote, "The standards direct teachers to fill their syllabi with materials drawn from different cultures, but with no guidance as to the enduring literary value of various works. As a result, sensitivity to diversity prevails over traditional literary and historical knowledge."
That's right. There is no sequential and coherent literature curriculum or reading curriculum from K to 12 or even from 7 to 12. If one wanted to say that at the elementary school level, just let kids read whatever they want because they should enjoy reading. But we know that what is happening from 7 to 12 is not a literature curriculum. It's a skills-oriented curriculum that will claim to parents and to others that they are actually teaching a more demanding kind of curriculum that so-called employers want. Now, the next thrust is going to have to convince employers that lower-level workforce is indeed what they wanted. It's going to be a great con job when it's done, but so far, the people who are convincing this country's citizenry that they've got an education system that's aiming upwards while it's aiming downwards, they've done a great job. So they're going to convince the Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers. If they've convinced everybody else that black is white, that freedom is slavery, I don't see any problem for them in convincing the rest of the workaday world that we've got what they want. It's just that the rest of the world isn't going to go along with whatever our little business world wants to believe from our educators. We haven't talked yet about schools of education. We need to do that.
You're exactly right. I think one of the biggest problems we have, and maybe if you'd be gracious enough, we'll have you come back in a couple weeks. You and I can do a half an hour just on departments of education. I think that would be a very meaningful talk to have. And so I won't let you forget. I'm going to schedule that with you as soon as we hang up here. But we can't let you go. That final word, we've got to say a little bit about the math standards too. And you mentioned that your associate, Jim Milgram, renowned math professor, one of the only two people on the validation committee, along with yourself, who actually had the kind of standards experience that was meaningful. And he, like you, he was completely ignored by the Common Core Validation Committee, despite the work that you guys were trying to do for them. The math standards are pretty shocking, too. According to results released by the National Center for Education Statistics, the NCES, in 2016, the average score in the United States on the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, the PIRLS, dropped to 549 out of 1,000 from an average score of 556 in 2011. These results translate into the nation's decline from 5th all the way down to 13th in 58 different educational systems. And Common Core is showing, however you rebrand Common Core, that our kids are not getting one bit better. The shocking statistic, and I want you to talk about this as we wind down, Sandy. 37%.
And what I have raised as a question is, why wasn't Congress demanding an investigation in these Pearl scores? That is independent of Common Core. So here we have an independent voice, as TIMSS is. That's the test of 4th and 8th and even advanced level math and science. Pearls is a test that's created by independent groups of 4th grade reading, and yet we've had a decline that we have seen, but Congress isn't apparently concerned about a decline for everyone. And I don't understand why not. Why shouldn't we, instead of demanding whatever it wants to investigate in other areas, in addition to that, because I'm not willing to exclude whatever it is currently investigating, but at least it should be interested in the educational level, because that's where our future citizens are going to come from. I doubt that in 10 years, we'll have anybody graduating from public high schools who can read our founding documents.
I think you're exactly right. The getting rid of cursive writing at the lower levels isn't helping that either. But I'll go on a little bit further to say, based on what you just said, I think it makes a lot of sense. Why isn't Congress more upset about, listen to this. In April 2016, an NAEP result showed that only about 37% of 12th graders are prepared to do math and reading at the college level. So we're talking 1/3 of our public school graduates, 1/3 are prepared to do college level reading, writing, and math. Where is the outrage over this? Where are our progressive universities in demanding this gets fixed? Where is Congress? Where is the Department of Education? We've been trying this, and as you said, it's not just Common Core. Before Common Core, you had No Child Left Behind, and before that, you had Goals 2000, going back 40, 50 years to the creation of the Department of Education. The bigger the tests get, the more we standardize education, the farther kids fall behind. Where is the outrage? The educators. You and I saw, I think, Sandy, across the country when we were going back and forth all over the place, we saw a lot of frustrated teachers, right? But even they, the pressure they feel now, some of the best teachers have retired and walked away. And just like we're about to have a shortage of doctors, seems like there's a shortage of teachers on the way. Education departments are shrinking. There are fewer and fewer kids willing to go into education. That makes sense, because teachers aren't teachers anymore. Who wants to spend their career, even if they're making a pretty decent salary, who wants to spend their career doing babysitting for 8 hours a day?
Well, the salaries will help to some extent, and they will be prepared to be supported by their administrators if they are aiming at the bottom group. And that becomes the key, because no one is really outraged about 57 or 77, whatever the percentage is, of students who can't do proficient or advanced work at any grade level, because the tables will always be turned and someone will say, look at all the kids whose talents are being wasted, who should be up to that level, who are not either teaching correctly or providing the kind of support that we should be providing. So in other words, we're not spending enough money to help the low achievers become high achievers. Built in is this assumption that all low achievers can become higher achievers. No other country could operate an educational system in this fashion. how we got convinced or felt so guilty about having an educational system in which there are some low achievers. They're always going to be there. But we have accepted this guilt trip that we're going to have to deal with the bottom, and unless we raise the bottom, it really doesn't matter where the top is. So the top can continue to slide as long as the bottom is not going where it is, and the charge is that we're not spending enough money on it.
Well, I can support everything you...
cumbersome, detailed kind of approach, but this is how I see people reckoning with the problem of we've got declining standards and declining levels, but who cares?
I support everything you just said. As a university professor, they make us feel guilty for teaching the traditional literature, right? To teach Shakespeare, to teach the great Western classics, right, to try to expose kids to the great arguments and books of world history. We're ashamed of that now because they're not diverse enough, or they're pitched too high, or they assume knowledge that kids don't have. And so we stop teaching those books. Dr. Sandra Stotsky, it has been a pleasure to be with you. We're going to talk real soon about education departments and what we can and can't do about them. Thank you for your time and for being so gracious. Thank you for all your work over the years on this. I wish more people had listened. Let's end on a kind of a classical nerd note. Has anybody ever called you Cassandra? Right? Do you remember Cassandra from the Greek world?
Actually, in recent years, people are saying, I am the prophetess of doom, well, and no one is going to pay attention to me. And this is what is happening.
For all those high school educated kids who don't know who Cassandra is, she was a Trojan princess who was cursed with the gift of prophecy. She would always be able to tell the truth, but no one would believe her. You probably won't learn that in your high schools anymore. Dr. Stotsky, thank you very much. We'll be in touch soon. If you enjoyed that video, please consider following us online, and also consider a tax-deductible donation so we can continue to produce quality videos like the one you just watched. I'm Dr. Duke. Thanks for watching.